Not all segments perform the same, and sometimes you want to compare them side by side. So I'll show how I built this dashboard in Tableau. And at the end, I'll show how to add these buttons that let users drill down into details for any segment. I'm starting by connecting to a data source that has some Google data. This is fictional data that I had ChatGPT generate. Then I created a dashboard so I could bring an image on as my background. And originally I created this using annotations in Tableau, but there was just too many to keep track of, so I decided to do it in Canva instead. That way I can get perfect alignment for each of these cards since we're representing the segments side by side. I also used an image to add the Google icon so it's instantly clear what company this dashboard is for. And then used a text box for the title. And even though this is technically for Alphabet, Google is more recognizable and the colorful logo adds a fun touch. So I matched the rest of the text for Google to the same colors as the icon. That way we get one cohesive title when I place it next to the Google icon. I also used text boxes for the segment titles. I kept all of the text in Tableau so it's easy to update, and added these titles for all 4 of Google or Alphabet's major revenue segments. And now for the actual visuals. I started with a KPI card for revenue. And the vision I have is to show the revenue amount for each segment with a small area chart as a sparkline to show the trend. And then I'll show how to get this framed look directly in Tableau so the card has rounded corners. And I'll start with the revenue amount on a new worksheet. I'll bring segment into the columns, then revenue into the marks and make it text. And I want to filter the period for this so that it's only this year's revenue. Then I'll change the number formatting for revenue to be in billions with 1 decimal. I'm using the text mark type so I have full control over the formatting. So I can use text within the marks to edit it. And I'll add the text revenue. Then I'll align these on the left, make them more bold, and adjust the font size. And I'll just make the revenue extra bold so it stands out. And because the mark type is text, I can also drag segment in as a color. That way I can use the legend to edit the colors and assign different colors for each segment. And the text will take on that segment's color. I'm also going to sort the segment, that way it's in the same order as the cards on the dashboard. Then I'll remove the headers for segment and quickly format the worksheet to remove the shading and row dividers. That way we're left with just the revenue. And before I add this to the dashboard, I'll quickly build the area charts. And since this is over time, I'm going to drag period into the columns. Then I'll make this in terms of quarters. Then I'll drag revenue into the rows. And under mark type, I'll change this to an area. This is going to be for the first segment, so I'm going to change the color to red and make it 25% opacity. Then I'll give it a border that same color of red. I'll remove the header and then format the worksheet so I can go through and remove all these lines. Then I'll remove the other header since this chart is just meant to show the trend. And I'll drag segment into the filters so I can pick the first segment. And to create this for all segments, I'll just duplicate the worksheet, update the filter, and change the colors for each one. And I'll repeat that process until I have 4 area charts. Then I'll bring them onto a dashboard and remove their titles so I end up with a clean set of revenue trends for each segment. And I'll bring in the revenue worksheet, hide its title, remove the legend, and set it to fill the entire view. Then I'll layer this on top of the area charts. And before I add the frames, I noticed the text is kind of overlapping with the area charts. So I'm going to show a quick trick to fix that by dynamically capping the axis. So basically limiting how tall the chart can go. And we just need one calculated field to cap the axis for all the worksheets. This formula I'm pasting in here, which is also in the description, takes the difference between the highest and lowest revenue in the view, doubles it, and adds it to the lowest value. And this gives us a number that's 2 times the range above the minimum. So if you want to adjust this to make sure it's taking up 1/4 of the space, you can make the 2 a 4. Next, I'll add this field to the view, and then make the time discrete. That way I can add a reference line using the Analytics tab. And I'll add one for the whole table. I'll use the axis cap as the value, and take the maximum. And Tableau will stretch the axis to include the reference line. So once I edit the axis for revenue, and uncheck including 0, Tableau can stretch the chart based on the formula instead of always starting at 0. And we don't need to actually see the reference line, so I'm going to make it invisible. And you'll see once I apply this to all the other worksheets using that same exact formula, the area charts all get capped at half the worksheet's height. It's a small design trick, but it makes a big difference when you're working with limited space and you don't want things to overlap. To give the revenue cards a more polished look, I'm going to add rounded corner frames. And you could do this with images, but since I have 4 segments, it's easier to do it all within one worksheet. Plus, the frames will automatically pick up the segment color. So I'll add segment to the columns and segment to the marks. Then I'll change the mark type to a shape and make segment determine the color. Then I'll use shape within the mark so I can go to more shapes and choose my custom palette. I created this image in Canva and will link it in the description. It's just a transparent rounded corner shape with a colored background around it. To isolate the frames, I'll start by hiding the headers. Then I'll format the worksheet so I can remove the shading and the row dividers. So now we can see just the frames. I also need to sort the segment so it's in the same order as the cards on the dashboard. And I'll go to the dashboard to add this worksheet. I'll hide the title of the worksheet, remove the legend, and set this to fill the entire view. Now I just need to layer these frames over the cards so I can get a cohesive layout. And to make those frames fit better, I can go to the frame worksheet and use the size slider to increase it. These cards are great for showing a key metric with this trend. The rounded corners help soften the design, while the color contrast makes the content stand out. Since we already have revenue in its trend, next I want to add something to show the progress towards a revenue goal. So I'll build a circular progress chart with dots. And the first step to plotting any circular visual is to use the Data Source tab to union the data. This will give us the extra rows we need to plot each dot around the circle. First, I'll create a parameter, so I can define the number of points I want to use. That way we can dynamically change the number of dots. Then I'll create a calculated field to space the points. And since table name is what distinguishes the unionized tables, I'll use a formula that checks if the table name contains 1. If it does, then I'll assign the value 1. Otherwise, I'll use the number of points parameter. And I like using the contains 1, so it works even if I rename the data source. Next, I'll create another calculated field to spread the dots evenly around the circle by calculating the angle for each point. All of these formulas are in the description, but this one basically gives each dot a spot around the circle by evenly dividing the full circle based on the total number of dots. And we also need to plot the x and y positions, so I'm going to use the sign of the angle field for x. And this will give us the horizontal position for each point along the circle, based on its angle. Then I'll just duplicate this field, edit it so I can change it to cosine for the y position. And now we can build the structure. I'll start by moving x into the columns and y into the rows. Then I'll right-click on the points field so I can create some bins. And I'll set the size of the bins to 1. Then I'll bring this bins field into the marks. That way I can set the table calculation for x to compute using the bins. And I'll do the same thing for y. This works because bins control the order of the points, and computing using them makes sure that each dot gets the right position around the circle. I'll change the mark type to a circle. And since the number of bins comes from the parameter in the formula, we can use the number of points parameter to control how many circles appear in the chart. But right now all the circles are the same color, so it's not actually showing any progress. We just need one more calculated field that uses the progress value to set the colors for the circle. This formula compares each circle's position using index to a progress target based on a metric, which in this case I'm using revenue as the metric, and 215 billion as the target. I'm dividing by 2 because the union doubled the rows. And I'm multiplying by the number of points to convert the percentage progress into the number of circles to fill. And this will tell Tableau which circles should be filled to represent progress. So I'll pull this into the marks and apply some filters, because I only want to look at one segment and 1 year. And because we're not using any LODs, we don't need to adjust the formulas. I'll right-click on the colors field so I can compute using the bins, and I'll change this to a color. And if you want to enhance this to show the actual progress, you can type 0 into the rows, then right-click to make this a dual access. And using that second mark, I'm going to change the mark type to text. I'll remove everything in there and type revenue divided by the target. Then I'll make this text. But you can see it's over 100% right now because I need to divide this by 2 since I unioned the data, and that duplicated the number of rows. So you can see it's about 74%, and that's the same progress that's visually represented by how many circles are filled in blue. And I can use the parameter to change the number of points, and the colors will adjust to always show that 74%. For some formatting, I'm going to start by removing the headers. Then I'll format the worksheet so I can remove the shading, the row and column dividers, And under lines, I'll remove the grid lines and the zero lines. Then I'll format the progress value so I can change the number formatting to a percentage with no decimals. And I can format the text itself using text within the second mark. I'll just make the percentage bigger and bolder so it stands out. And add some text like progress this year to provide context. And we could add even more metrics here like the actual dollar amount. Under the first mark, I'll remove the measure name's coloring. That way I can edit the colors using the legend. And because this is going against a dark red background, I'll make the completed circles a solid white, and the remaining ones fully transparent, using this custom hex code I loaded into my color palette. And since this is going on a dark background, I'm also going to change the text to white so it matches. Then on the dashboard, I'll add the circular progress chart with dots. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and resize it to be next to the revenue card. But you can see we can't really see the transparent circles at the moment. So I'll go back to the worksheet, and under our first mark, which is for the circles, I'm going to give these a white border. That way we can still see the dots representing the progress not made. I'll also remove everything in the tooltip to avoid any confusion. Now we have a great way to show progress that's modern and intuitive. And because the number of points is controlled by a parameter, we can easily scale it to fit the layout, adding more dots for when we have more space, and fewer dots for when we have less space. For the other segments, I just duplicated the worksheet, updated the filter, and adjusted the goal amount for each one. And because I unioned the data for the progress chart, I need to go back to the revenue worksheet so I can filter for just one of the tables. That way I'm not duplicating the revenue amount. Next, I want to compare revenue to the operating income and calculate the operating margin. So I'll use a nested bar chart because it'll show how much revenue turns into operating income. And I'll start by adding period to the rows. Then I'll make this in terms of quarters and change this to be discrete. My first metric is going to be revenue, so I'm going to drag that into the columns. And the second metric will be the operating income, so I'll drag that into the columns as well. I'll right-click to make it a dual axis and then synchronize the axes. And I'll change both marks to be bars. A nested bar chart is a type of bar chart where a smaller bar, like the operating income, is placed inside of a larger bar like revenue. That way we can visually compare the two. And because revenue is the larger bar in this case, I made it my first mark. That way it sits behind the operating income. So I can use the first mark to customize it. Once I remove the measure names coloring, I can use color in the mark to pick a color for the revenue. And I want operating income to sit in front, so that's why it's my second mark. And I'll do the same thing with this measure. I'll remove the measure names coloring, so I can use color in the marks to pick a color for my operating income. And I picked white here because this is going to go against a dark red background. So I think it'll really pop. I'll also make the text bold and white so it's visible. Then for the borders, I'll remove the row and column dividers. And for the lines, I'll remove the zero lines, the column grid lines, and the axis ticks. Then I'll remove both axes. And I want to add the actual operating margin in here. So under the first mark, I'll type the formula for operating margin, which is the operating income divided by the revenue. Then I'll change this metric to be a label. And I need to add some filters. So I'll start by filtering for just one segment. And I'll also filter for just one table because I needed to union the data for the progress chart. And now that the operating margin looks right for each quarter, I'll format the operating margin so that the number format is a percentage with no decimals. And I also don't need all these quarters in here. So I'm going to use period to filter the table so I'm looking at just the last 4 quarters. That way it doesn't take up as much space on the dashboard. Then I'll hide the field label for quarter and add this to the dashboard. I'll hide the title of the worksheet, resize it, and set this to fill the entire view. Since I'm working with a small space, I'm going to set the font size to 8. That way I can keep everything compact and easy to fit. And I'll do this for the operating margin as well so it's consistent. I just need to use the mark to change the font size to 8. I'll also use the size slider to make both of the bars slightly smaller. Then using color in the marks, I'm going to give these a white border. And that helps visually separate the light pink bars from the red background. And we also need a title for this visual. So I'm going to pull in a text box and type revenue versus the operating income. Then I'll format this to be bolder, bigger, and white. Now we have an easy way to compare revenue and operating income at a glance, showing not just the values, but also how efficiently each segment is turning revenue into profit. And this is super nitpicky, but I don't like how close the bars are to the percentages. So within the worksheet, I'll go to the first mark so I can edit the text and add a few spaces before. And this will just give it a little bit more breathing room. Then I'll repeat that same process, just swapping out the filter and color for each segment. And this nested bar chart lets us compare revenue and operating income within the same bar. And since this is a scorecard, I want to show the forecast versus the actuals. So I'll use this visual to show how you can create a side-by-side bar chart without pivoting the data, which is especially useful for when your data source has separate fields for actuals and forecasts and doesn't support pivoting. I'll start by moving period into the columns, and I'll make this in terms of quarters. Then I'll add the net income actual field to the rows, and I'll move the net income forecast field to the rows. I'll make these a dual axis and then synchronize the axes. And under the all marks, I'll change these to be bars. But you can see right now they're overlapping. And if I use the first mark to set a fixed size, it changes the width of the bar, but the positioning stays grayed out. So I'll show how we can unlock that setting to control the bar placement using one calculated field. This calculation uses date trunk to group the data by quarter based on the period field. So it's basically changing the date to the first day of its quarter. So I'll pull this calculation into the columns instead of our previous period field. And the trick here is to make sure it's using the exact date. And now I can use size in the marks to give this a fixed width. And because I want these in terms of quarters, which is about 90 days, I'm going to make this bar about 40 days. And you can see the alignment's no longer grayed out. I'll do the same thing for the second mark, giving this a fixed width of 40 units. And this time I'll change the alignment to be on the right. A weird thing you might notice is that I set the forecast bar to fixed right, but it's showing up on the left. And that's because the alignment setting controls where the bar is anchored, not where it ends up. So fixed right means the bar starts on the right and grows left, while the actual bar is fixed left, so it starts on the left and grows to the right. Now that we got the bars side to side, there's a few tweaks to make things more clear, starting with the date format on the axis. I'll do a custom format and type YY for the last two numbers of the year. Then I'll do a dot and the string Q, and then the Q for the quarter. But there's obviously too many labels on the axis right now. So I'll edit the axis so I can change the marks to be fixed. And for the unit, I'll select quarters. So this looks right. But for Q4 2023, if I hover over the bar, you can see it should be Q1 2024. And that's because we're using a custom formula for the axis. So I just need to adjust that formula to add a constant like 90. Now you might need to adjust this number depending on your date field, or if you're using a different time period. I'll post a separate video that walks through how to handle different time periods, like month or year, and how to offset each one depending on how your date field is structured. But for this case, I adjusted it to 88 days and it lined up just about right. So now that the structure is built, I'll start on the formatting. This right bar is for the actuals. So I'll start on the first mark and remove the measure name coloring. That way I can use color in the marks to choose a red that matches the segment coloring. For the second mark, I'll remove the measure name coloring, and this time pick a pink color. Then using the all mark, I'll use color in the mark so I can add a white border to both bars. I'll format the worksheet so I can change all the fonts to that matching red, and make them Tableau medium. Then for the borders, I'll remove the row and column dividers. And for the lines, I'll remove the zero lines, the axis ticks, and the row grid lines. And we don't need both of these headers, so I'm going to remove the one on the right. Then I'll edit the axis on the left so I can remove the title. And I'll also edit the date axis so I can remove the title. To make these bars a little bit smaller, I can use size within the marks. And I'll just decrease the width. And since the size is independent of the position, it doesn't mess up the axis. I'm also going to use one of the other worksheets to borrow that period filter so we're looking at just the last 4 quarters. Then I'll add a filter for segments so we're looking at just one. And I'll also filter by table name since we had to union the data for the progress chart. Now I can add the forecast versus actual bar chart onto the dashboard. I'll hide the title and resize it to fit within this white container. I repeated that same process, just changing out the filters and colors for all the segments. Next, I needed a title for all these visuals, so I added in a text object and typed net income trend. And I have 2 ideas for legend, but I want to see how both of them look first. My first idea is to add forecast and actual labels directly into this text box. Then after formatting, I matched each color's word to its corresponding bar. This method is super quick and clearly shows which bar is which, but I don't love how it looks. So for my second idea, I changed the title to just keep the net income trend. And then I made this red to match the visual. And I'll use one worksheet that acts as a custom legend for all the bars and segments. I'll start by double-clicking on measure names to create a table. Then I'll remove all the measure values that aren't the actual and the forecast. And I don't need these values, so I'm going to change the measure values to detail, add measure names, and make that the label. For the net income actual, I'm going to edit the alias so it's just actual. And I'll do the same thing to shorten the forecast label. And so I'm only using one worksheet. I'm going to drag segment into the columns. Then I'll flip measure names to the rows. And now we have a 4x2 table that has a combo of actual and forecast for each segment. I'll change the mark type to a square so it looks more like a legend. And type 0 into the columns to align the text on the left. And I'm going to use these squares to match the colors of the bars. So I'll drag measure names in and make it a color. Then I'll do the same thing for segment. Now I can edit the legend to assign colors to each square. And I'll match them to the bar colors used for each segment on the dashboard. So darker colors for the actuals and lighter colors for the forecast. I also need to sort the segment so it's the same order as the cards on the dashboard. Then for formatting, I'll start by removing all of the headers. I'll format the worksheet so I can remove the shading. Then under borders, I'll remove the row and column dividers. And for the lines, I'll remove the 0 lines and the column grid lines. So now we're left with just a legend showing actuals and forecasts for each segment. To format the text itself, I'll use label in the marks. And I'll make this Tableau regular and slightly smaller. Then on the dashboard, I can add the Legends worksheet. I'll hide the title of the worksheet, remove the default legend, and resize this so each segment's legend lands in the corresponding card. And while you may need to tweak the sizing a bit, this method is efficient since we're only using one worksheet for all the legends across the segments. Now I just need to copy this title over for all the other segments. I also added a small subtitle to give context and to align the title with the legend. That way the layout looks more balanced. We already have a lot of great info for comparing the segments, but we're missing how big each segment is compared to the others. And since I don't have a space for a pie chart or a tree map, I'm going to use the empty space at the bottom to add a revenue contribution bar. This will show the percentage of total revenue each segment contributes. And because I want this bar to have rounded ends, I'll start by pulling measure values into the columns. Within the measure values list, I'll type 0 and remove everything else so I'm left with just the 0 and the revenue. Then I'll pull revenue into the columns. I'll make these a dual axis and then synchronize the axes. And the first mark is going to give us those rounded ends. So I'm going to keep the mark type a circle. And I'll make measure names determine the color of these circles. The second mark will be the actual bar that represents each segment's portion of total revenue. So I'll change the mark type to a bar and drag segment in and make it a color. Then I'll just sort these segments so they're in the same order as I have on the dashboard. That way I can assign the end colors correctly. So this left circle representing 0 is going to be the rounded end on the left. So I'll edit the color for measure names and change the color of 0 to that first segment, which is red. And I'll do the same thing for the left end, making it the same color as the last segment. Then I can use the size slider to adjust so it looks like one cohesive rounded bar. And I want to add some context in here. So I'm going to drag the metric represented by the bars, which is revenue, into the second mark. And I'll use a quick table calculation to get the percent of total. Then I'll make this a label. I'll format this so the number formatting is a percentage with no decimals. And I'll use label in the mark to format the text. I'll make this really bold in size 11 font. And I'm going to make all these white. To format, I'll start by removing the headers. Then I'll format the worksheet so I can remove the worksheet shading, the row and column dividers, and for lines, the 0 lines and the column grid lines. And if you wanted to add even more context, you could drag segment into the second mark and make it a label. Then just make sure you allow the labels to overlap so you can see them. But my dashboard already has this information in it, so I'm going to remove that. And I'll add this contribution bar to the dashboard. I'll hide the title of the worksheets, remove the legend, and I want to set this to fill the entire view. Then I'll resize this worksheet to be under the cards. I also want to add some context about what this bar represents. So I'll use a text box and type revenue contribution. Then I'll format the text to be the same as the text within the bar. And I'll just position this text at the beginning so it acts as a title for the visual. This contribution bar adds a lot of value in a compact space. It shows how much revenue each segment contributes using the color and percentage labels. This dashboard is almost completely full, so the last visual I'm adding is a set of plus signs that expand to show more details for each segment. And this will let users take a deeper dive without crowding the dashboard. Since I'm going to have one of these pluses for each segment, I'll start by moving segment into the columns. Then I'll create a parameter and show how to transform it to behave like a multi-value parameter. That way users can expand multiple plus signs at once. I'll change the data type to a string and leave the current value empty. Next, we need to determine if a segment is selected, and we can use a calculated field for that. I'll type contains, the plus parameter, comma the segment. And this will return true when the segment is in the parameter list. So I'm going to move this field into the marks, change the mark type to a shape, and make the selected field determine the shape. You can see that right now they're all false, and that's because nothing's selected within the parameter. I left this blank on purpose so we can use a calculated field to dynamically populate it. This is saying if the segment's already in the parameter list, then remove it. And if it's not in the list, add it to the parameter with a comma at the end. So this logic allows us to store multiple values in a single parameter. So I need to move this field into the marks so I can use it in the action later. But before I add the action, I'm just going to quickly sort the segment so it's in the order I want. Then I'll hide the header for segment, format the worksheet, and remove the shading and row dividers. Now on the dashboard, I can add the worksheet. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and set this to fill the entire view. Then I'll resize the worksheet. That way each shape sits neatly next to its segment title. And to make these buttons functional, I'll go to the Dashboard tab at the top and hit Actions. I'll add a Change Parameter action, and under Source Sheets, I'll start by unchecking everything that is in the plus worksheet. I'll target the plus parameter and use the segment value as the source field. So now when I click on one of the shapes, you can see it changes from false to true. So instead of a circle, it's a square. But these shapes aren't super intuitive. So using the shapes that come with Tableau, I'm going to assign false a filled-in plus sign, and true a filled-in X. I also want to make these symbols match the colors on my dashboard. So within the worksheet, I'll drag segment into the marks and make this a color. And this is a small thing, but I don't love the default highlighting when interacting with this worksheet. So I'm going to show how to remove that before I customize the icons and add the expanding details. This is super easy. We just need to create a calculated field for true with the value true. Then I'll create another calculated field for false with the value false. Then I'll add both of these into the marks. And on the dashboard, I'll use the Dashboard tab again to add an action. But this time I'll add a filter action to remove that highlighting effect. For the source sheet, I'll start by unchecking everything that isn't the plus worksheet. Then for the target sheet, I'll use the drop-down to select the plus worksheet. I want clearing the section to show all values, and I want to run the action on select. Then I'll choose selected field so I can set true as the source field and false as the target field. Now I can interact with these buttons without that highlighting effect. Next, I'll show how we can use custom shapes for these buttons. Instead of just using whether the segment is selected or not to determine the shape, instead I'll take the string of this true-false field, then add the segment field. And this will give us a combination of values of whether it's selected or not, and the segment. Then I'll remove the segment coloring. And now I can pick my custom shapes. I created these in Canva and loaded them in here, but I have another video on how to do that. And using the size slider, I can increase the size of these shapes. On the dashboard, I'll toggle each of these buttons to their other state. Then I'll edit the shapes again and assign each one to the shapes. This gives us full control over the design of the buttons. Now that we've set up the dynamic zone visibility, we just need to create what we want to show or hide. And I'm just going to fast forward through me creating a simple table with metrics for my dataset. But you can use any visual you want. And since the buttons control whether the worksheet appears for a given segment, you can literally build whatever visual you want inside this space. Then just go to the dashboard and add the worksheet. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and set this to fill the entire view. And to make sure the dynamic zone visibility works, so that we only see the table when the plus icon is clicked, We can go to the worksheet and drag in the segment selected field to the filters, and set this to only true. That way the details only show when the segments button is selected. And so we don't confuse users with all these details, I'll go to the plus worksheet and remove everything in the tooltip. That way we don't see any text when we click the button. The table's position is also independent of the button, so you can place it anywhere on your dashboard and it doesn't have to be aligned with the button for the expand collapse functionality to work. The last thing I'm thinking here is to change the background color of the table. That way it kind of stands out better. Then I'll just duplicate the worksheet, swap out the filter and color for each segment, and add them all to the dashboard. In under 30 minutes, we built a segment comparison scorecard for Google using fictional financial data I had ChatGPT generate. The goal was to clearly compare business segments without overwhelming the layout, so keeping everything informative and easy to navigate. I focused on key financial metrics that work well for side-by-side comparisons. And with the expandable details sections for each segment, users can take a deep dive into what they need without cluttering the main view.